And it seems like there's a lot of conflicting information about it. Like some people, even if they acknowledge Kundalini, they will say, some say that it doesn't really cause, it's not involved in awakening. It's doing its own thing with energy wise. It's not related to an awakening, and it doesn't cause an awakening.
Yes, no, so you're absolutely right. And this in turn is linked and related to, again, to the way this misinterpretation and misunderstanding that the process is spoken. So let us now, maybe it's the first time when we need to really tread gently here, so as not to rush through this with a kind of a blanket response, let alone statement. Because there is a reason why there is this perspective, there is this understanding that Kundalini, speaking of the spiritual process of homecoming or self-actualization, self-realization, is, and I will just give few perspectives of how this process is viewed, from more moderate to more kind of radical, extreme sense of denial. One is that where people acknowledge, right, where there is this acknowledgement, yes, that there is this profound experience of Kundalini, but it's a kind of like not quite clear what is the purpose of that and where it will lead, and whether this at all actually leads to the self-realization, whether it actually delivers, despite all that what New Age so eagerly adopted into its vernacular, right? All these chakra systems, all these psychic centers, and everyone knows this today. So that kind of like it's becoming a commonly held knowledge. So this other perspective where Kundalini is seen as a nuisance, almost like an undesirable experience, almost like a diversion, almost like something that one is better off without. If one wants to progress on the path, leave it alone to those yogis or those who want to manipulate some, forces of nature. This is, we have nothing to do with it. And there is a more radical perspective that Kundalini is, it's just a kind of invention. It's the cultural invention. It doesn't exist. It's it's just some pranic activity, and even the term pranic activity is not used. Some energetic biochemistry. So in other words, it's being dismissed on the account of it belonging to the neurophysiological activity of the body. Usually this radical perspective comes from these ultra echelons of New Advaita, where very little understanding, in fact, on the process altogether. And I've encountered that from my early years when I began to teach publicly and attended conferences where I spoke, and it just baffled me how how some people are completely lost in a gagaland of mental kind of concepts, thinking that this body is just something unrelatable to the whole process. And it took years, literally. I could credit myself for bringing the term body into the Science and Non-Duality Conference as early as 2012, and the term embodiment and the heart well before it was spoken by some of the more well-known teachers years later. Only when this term embodiment began to somehow be introduced, again, in California, in that Bay Area, spilling out from there into other Anglo-Saxon countries, into the Latin country, because that's really where it comes from. Then the picture and the scene began to change. So, but where are these differences come from? Why there is no agreement? Why would there be this discrepancy? And the discrepancy has its analogus in the history, in the culture. So indeed, even within Indian culture, there were many schools of yoga where the awakening of Kundalini force was achieved forcibly. And the Hatha Yoga itself, it's enough to read the key scripture of Hatha Yoga, which is Hatha Yoga Pradipika of Swami Swatmarama, to understand the full degree of that yogic science and what was going on in terms of the approaches and perspectives. It's a very austere, very almost like militant-like, approach, which required a lot of dedication, of course, a lot of that. A lot of this, it's a kind of a warrior path, a lot of sacrifice, self-sacrifices, path fitting the renunciate. Because the practice is alone, it's like you'll have a day filled with all the stuff one would need to do just to prepare the body endlessly through series of purificatory rites so as to finally receive that initiation or Shakti path from one spiritual preceptor, and then retreat for a number of years to be given to that process. And there are varieties of ways of how this works. I'm not going to go into this Hatha Yoga Pradipika intricacies, because this is not really what the main idea of what we discuss here. But this gave already a certain, it colored the tradition in a certain way. Whilst at the same time there were other traditions in India, the tradition of Siddhas, of the Maharashtra state, or the Tamil Nadu, the South India, where Kundalini, of course, was this power which was spoken in terms of transmission, mainly through the means of transmission. Therefore, emphasis on the Guru Shishya, and on that lineage kind of passing, where that tradition, that process of igniting Kundalini, and one has to be a qualified Shaktipat master in order to assist that process. And then it's not so much with the assistance of this severe and very militant-like yogic practices, but more the sadhana of these siddhas is different. They kind of, it's lesser, let's say, in its forcibly used methodologies. It was more kind of rubbing the shoulders or holding hands with the Bhakta movement that swept across India centuries earlier, and that Bhakta movement produced these waves where the very much kind of that access to that energy was given through devotion. So if anyone goes into these studies of this phenomenology of siddhas, these accomplished ones in India, then one would find that they are inseparable from that Bhakta movement of the early poets of India, like Kalidas, Kabir, all these modern bhajans people sing. They all were composed back in the day most of them were composed by this, devotional, by nature, men and women. So their approach and work with Kundalini was already different. Then we have this whole body of Brahmins, the whole class of Brahmins. We have this whole kind of scholar, kind of top of the hierarchy of Indian caste system, where Vedic studies is their business, is their job, is their occupation. Where Kundalini is not figured in terms of the term, in the language. The discourses, the recitation and everything is emphasizes different aspects. Not that they did not know about Kundalini. Not that that force was not utilized there. It's just emphasis was made on knowledge, philosophical aspect. And it is that where some of the more modern teachers, like Ramana Maharshi in the 20th century, belong to. Not that he came from that cut. He is a self-taught guru, as we know. He did not have guru of his own. So he was only familiar with maybe a couple of scriptures. We know that Ribhu Gita or Ashtavakra Gita were one of his favorite ones. And that's what most of the modern non-dual teachers will probably have access to and know. Ribhu Gita, probably one of the most known non-dual scriptures that modern day teachers of that so-called lineage know about. So in these scriptures you will not find references to Kundalini. You will not find references to the power of Shakti. So therefore, that already gave us this, you see, divergence of how the power behind the transformation is being viewed and utilized. In other words, in some traditions, it was explicitly clear. And I would like to speak about that in a moment. For instance, in the Tantric traditions, of course, Kundalini was the chief deity in practically all Tantras. You will not find Tantra when there is no Shakti. There is no Shakti, there is no Tantra. And so Kundalini Shakti is the chief deity of the process of transformation. It's one's consciousness. It's a transformation of consciousness. So it's seen in esoteric terms and in the actual factual terms verified by countless experiences of the Tantrikas of how that process unfolds. So therefore this language is different. And very often that language was dressed in metaphor, appropriate metaphor. In some cases to keep it away from the uninitiated, to keep it away from the people who might taper with these teachings, to keep it safe. It's like working with a very powerful methodology. So tradition will make sure that it doesn't fall into the hands of someone who can hurt themselves or others. It's as simple as that, perhaps. So, putting speculations aside, why exactly, we know that many Tantric scriptures were composed in elaborate verse, in often metaphoric verse. And yet there were teachings which were more direct in its expositions, more philosophical. Thus, some of the Shastras of Kashmir Shaivism, right, they speak more directly about these processes without having to conceal them by poetic metaphor. But Kundalini as the goddess is worshipped in all tantras, worshipped and understood to be one and the only power that is capable of bringing about the release from the world of this samskaric kind of imprisonment or the field, where one can rise in that muck, through these waters as the symbology of the lotus flower, that though rooted in the mud, it comes as a fully blossoming flower, oozing nectar. So, when we spoke about Kundalini, maybe I should have mentioned that the term itself is with reference to the contracted consciousness. In even the term itself, Kundalini, it's coiled around the lingam 3.5 times, coiled, and spoken of as coiled at the base of the spine, in the subtle body. So, why is it today there is this kind of various perspectives? Well, the picture is twofold, at least twofold. For the simplicity's sake, I would like to give us this, perhaps, how and why it is actually justified, why this power is being marginalized in some ways, in other cases, maybe taken outside of proportion, is because it's very easy to speculate and very easy to fall prey to misconception and misperception when one goes through the process itself. It would require working with an adept to really know the degree of what the process really exemplifies. So therefore, many spiritual teachers, even those who worked with Kundalini, and most probably those who did work with Kundalini, they would be very careful in placing too much emphasis on that what already magnifies everything in the house, because that's what awakening is really very much, or the other side of awakening, the danger side, the kind of like the more sinister side of awakening, that it magnifies everything in the house. But I'm running a little bit ahead of what really you've asked. So going back to this, why some people dismiss it, marginalize it, and others think that this is all there is that because it's very difficult and nearly impossible to have any universally shared perspective where one can agree upon where one is in the process, and because only very few people fully go through that process of Kundalini. This is another thing that is so rarely spoken today, and you can only encounter this when you speak to people who have real understanding of the processes and have access to tradition. So, because of that, a lot of people have some experiences which are like Kundalini or seems like Kundalini. Some people have experiences simply because there is a lot of pranic activity in the body, and draw conclusions based on there are some activity, pranic activity in the body, that one is in the midst of a profound process of spiritual transformation of one's Kundalini. It's way too premature and speculative. So therefore, wise teachers, they work with this cautiously. But dismissing that is another extreme, because there is no transformation of consciousness whatsoever without that what consciousness essentially here represents in terms of its stage of identity with the body and mind. In fact, Kundalini can also be spoken in terms of that portion of Shakti that identifies with personal ahamkara, that principle of individuation. And it is the amount or the degree of the awakening of that power that gives one access to states of consciousness where one factually, viscerally undergoes this growth in consciousness where one is released from the grips of this identification with body-mind. So therefore, it's a kind of, on one hand, it's a part and parcel of the process. On the other hand, the reason why Kundalini is being such an uneasy topic is because very few people can actually be qualified to speak about this because they completed the journey. And people are in various degrees, on various kind of stages of that process, because the process itself can be so varied. From extremely mild and gradual to violent to intermediate. Violent means traditionally fast and rapid. And when it's fast and rapid, this is where our psyche is under direct assaults, because Kundalini and psyche here is, again, could be used in interchangeable terms. Everything that we have known about ourselves can be fractured in a very short period of time. And yet, if it's not accompanied or if it's not preceded by certain healthy philosophical perspective and psychological maturity, that is capable of giving us very undesirable, unpleasant states where, well, from depersonalization to being thrown into the phase of not knowing whether one is coming or going, where one is, who one is, because that loss of identity here is, though maybe spoken of as desirable from some point of view, because you kind of relax that tight grip. But if it's not accompanied by psychological maturity that requires to hold that process, then the outcome is a kind of mishmash, for a lack of different words, and nothing in terms of what self-realization can be spoken about. So the real work begins, in my books, with the awakening. Everything before that, all my students know that there is a saying we have that before awakening, one is one's teacher. One is one's master. One does as one pleases. It is after or upon awakening, one needs to have a qualitative guidance, because it's very difficult to make sense by doing it DIY style, by going it alone. So this is also why there are such divergent perspectives on role of Kundalini, and certainly if someone professes to teach direct path, and maybe there is this assumption that a direct path presupposes instantaneous realization, and one just gets it, then even that, we could say, has analogy in Shaiva, or speaking from the tradition of Shaivism. It has the analogy that, yes, in that case, one's Kundalini will proceed through a fastest possible route in the very rare scenario of immediate rising. But, if you want to speak about it, I don't know, but this is very rare, exceptionally rare. It's so rare that tradition, as soon as the scriptures speak about it, it immediately adds that it's so rare, there is no point to speak about it.